All right, welcome back to the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Today is Sunday, August 9th, 2020, and I wanted to go live today only to have a quick discussion about Grand Solar Minimum. And I had an interesting interaction with a subscriber who has been commenting on this channel for quite some time and seemed a bit confused about my stance on Grand Solar Minimums in previous predictions. It is true that back in 2017, Lee Wheelbarger was officially, associated with our channel, Grand Solar Minimum. We did have a disagreement in views on certain events. It was in the best interest for both Lee and I. We parted ways for a little while, and recently have, how should you say this, mended the wounds, build bridges again. We communicate over GSM topic. But with that being said, there has been a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about Grand Solar Minimum. Now, Lee taught me a lot of the basics, a lot of the foundation. The biggest thing that Lee did stress to me from day one was that Grand Solar Minimums do not create ice ages. That's one of the first things I asked him is, do Grand Solar Minimums cause ice ages? And he said no. And we talked a lot. I had a lot of questions for it about Grand Solar Minimum. But anyway, back to the comment section. I was asked if I had changed what changed my stance. You know, you predicted this. You said we were going to mini ice age, and I made the comment saying that, well, I didn't say that, but, you know, our associate Lee did. And she says, well, you acknowledge that Lee is part of your channel, so that's your channel, that's your stance. And at the time, yes. But like I said, there was a change in dynamics of the channel, and we were kind of looking at the information in a different viewpoint. Now, that doesn't mean that Lee is wrong. That doesn't mean that other channels that support those theories are wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the Grand Solar Minimum channel had a little bit different outlook on what's to come. So I'm glad that this subscriber commented in the comment section, because it gives me the opportunity to kind of finally officially say, okay, this is the information that we've been trying to provide since 2018. And this is where we stand officially on Grand Solar Minimum. Fact one. We follow the work of John L. Casey and Valentina Zarkova. And between those two people, we were really able to, and Lee in the beginning, because like I said, Lee did mentor me a lot on the basics of what was going on with solar cycles. So we formed a pretty solid foundation of info based on those three factors. If you look at Valentina Zarkova's models, she breaks down the super grand solar minimum as a 2,000-year cycle. And at the very beginning of that 2,000-year cycle is the strongest, I should say, the coldest grand solar minimum cycle of the entire super grand solar minimum cycle, the first one. Her work describes the super grand solar minimum cycles. When they begin, magnetic field strength begins to strengthen. Even though there are still periods of minimums and there are periods of weak magnetic field connections, they still uptick just a little bit each cycle in the first 1,000 years of the super grand solar minimum. In the second half of the super grand solar minimum, the magnetic field begins to tick downward in strength. Therefore, by the time we start a new super grand solar minimum cycle, we will be at the most minimal point of solar activity from our star in the last 2,000 years, hence why we saw the Maunder minimum, followed by the Dalton minimum, which was not anywhere as cold as it was in the minimum. It did have some issues, but nowhere near the strength and the duration as the Maunder. And now we are approaching the Jack Eddy minimum. Now, the Jack Eddy minimum, I agree with that name. The person I think has done the most research and accurate research. Jack Eddy did that. The thing I have a problem with is the length of this new grand solar minimum. Okay? Some folks say 80 to 150 years. Some folks say 400 to 1,000 years. But based on Zarkova's work, and John Casey as well, I believe that we are looking at a cooling period of 30 to 60 years. Now, Valentina Zarkova says from here through 2055. But I've kind of looked at that as maybe that it would be the bottom of the grand solar minimum before we start coming out of this period of low solar activity. So I think we see a lag from Zarkova's work into the 2060s, possibly the 2070s, before we start seeing normal sun strength once again. And that is the third phase of the super grand solar minimum. Now, we will not be alive for the following grand solar minimum after that, but we will see a moderation in strength in the next two grand solar minimum cycles before things start heading towards a Maunder minimum type situation, which in 2,000 years, well, another 1,500 years, we're not going to be around to see that. So if you do follow Valentina Zarkova's work, if you do follow John Casey's work, and especially Zarkova, because she lays it out there. She shows you what the 2,000-year cycle is and the strengths, and how the first 1,000 years of the 2,000-year cycle is an uptick. Even though we still see weak periods of magnetic field, we still have a strengthening each max cycle just by a little bit. And then after the next 1,000 years of that cycle, it starts heading towards the bottom, the lowest point. So my official stance on grand solar minimum, we are in the very beginning of grand solar minimum. This is the first cycle, solar cycle of the grand solar minimum. We will see weaker cycles over the next 3 to 4 decades at least. And potentially weaker cycles, 2 more weaker cycles after that before finally pulling back to normal. Or I should say a solar cycle 23-like cycle by 28 or 29. Let me show you. This is a chart, the work of Starman David Birch on Twitter. David has been around, excuse me, David has been around our channel from the very beginning, a very trusted source and researcher, and does excellent work. So if you want a lot of answers to grand solar minimum, follow him on Twitter at dbirch214. But this breaks it down on the predicted sunspot, what I always talk about, the smooth sunspot count, all right? Here we are for this right here was the last maximum we had in solar cycle 24, where my arrow is pointing at, okay? Oh, wait, hold on, 23, 21, wait, I gotta read this right. 14. Bear with me, folks. I just got this chart. Okay, 27, 34, 14. Okay, yeah. So the 118 was the maximum in 2014, which was solar cycle 24. Just to give you an idea on how these solar cycles work and how we get into these minimum cycles, or it's not just overnight. This steps down. This proves my point. This is solar cycle 25 prediction. And this is actually pretty close to what NASA put at 115. David Birch believes 116 will be that number. And then by the time we get to the max here in 2024, 2025 will be 86. You see how it continues to step down. And this is for the 2030s into the 2040s. And then we get to a maximum of right about what we're expected to have right now by the year 2060. So, according to Birch, we are going to see conditions like we have saw from this year and the years previous as well, all the way through the 2060s, before we start seeing some normalcy back to the sun again. Also, if you look at the very bottom of this chart, you'll see that there are the minimum counts as well. And those are at the bottom here in the next 3 cycles. And then we show here at the very end, things start to uptick again. So just because I'm saying grand solar minimum through the 2060s doesn't mean that we're not going to experience colder climates, heavier snow, flooding events, possibly more hurricanes, not directly affected in this, but in some way, shape, or form, there's an impact. Crop damage is absolutely a serious threat during grand solar minimums. This solar cycle 25 is just the beginning. Okay, the max, Birch is calling for 86 for this solar max coming up in 2025. 86. That's not a lot, guys. That's not very much at all. 180 to 240 is average. 86 is well below half than the normal strength of a max. And look at cycles before that, touching 285 as the smooth sunspot count. You can clearly see we are down 70% almost on that number. But it takes time to get to that. So it's going to be, the worst is coming. We have a solar cycle 25 that will experience a max sometime between 2023 and 2024. Sorry, Thomas, I was pointing at 24. You're right. This map is, I got diabetes, guys. I apologize. I couldn't see the years right. But anyway. But we are seeing evidence that we are in a minimum for the last 4 years. That's more than evident. And when you look at the predicted amount of numbers for solar cycle 24, and I believe that solar cycle 24, the actual came in lower than the prediction by a little. So if that's true, then we're still going to see these deteriorating conditions that we've seen over the past several years. Just because we're heading into a maximum of a cycle doesn't mean the grand solar minimum is over. The intensity of this maximum is what we're going to watch. So we can't say for sure that the max of solar cycle 25 is going to be this number. And I hate saying it like this, but you have to watch it over the next several years, just like we watched it go down. If it steps up the way that we have spoke of it speaking up, of stepping up, then people like David Birch and Valentina Zarkova and John Casey, they were right. This was not going to be a Maunder minimum type grand solar minimum. This was going to be somewhere between a Maunder and Dalton, which are still cold. Okay, that's not saying that we're not going to have challenging winters. That's not saying we're not going to have crop loss. That's not saying we're going to have large volcanic explosions that will cause cooling. Article that came out today on Watchers, I'll go over that on our next live broadcast, but also confirms cooling from volcanic eruptions. And historically, the empirical data shows that we get these larger eruptions during minimum cycles and grand solar minimums. And, you know, today we had a 5.1 earthquake in North Carolina. We also had an earthquake in Dallas. We had an earthquake in New Hampshire, Vermont area, all along the North American Craton. And all I could think about was what John Casey's talking about in his book Upheaval, about the New Madrid, and how something big is just around the corner between now and 2037. And is today's 5.1 a wake-up call? Again, I'm not downplaying the grand solar minimum at all. I'm just saying, for those of you who wonder, are we heading into an ice age? The answer is no. Based on Zarkova's work and the strength of the magnetic field, that's not possible if things follow like she has already formulated. So it's not possible for this upcoming grand solar minimum to go colder than Maunder unless we get a massive super volcano eruption that causes some serious global cooling. Something like a Yellowstone. Obviously, that would do more than just make people cold. That would kill a lot of people. You have to, that's an exception of the rule at that point, obviously. But if we don't get that super eruption, but we get a lot of large eruptions, and it's contributing, I think, slowly. Again, this is only the beginning of the grand solar minimum. And if you thought the last 4 years were intense, then this is our new normal right now. And when it gets better, it's going to be still above normal. But that's, if that makes any sense to you. In other words, the extreme weather in a normal part of our cycle in 25, 26, and 27 are still going to be way above average. So there's not going to be that relief of the weather getting back under control just because we're in a solar max in 2025. The intensity of the solar max is not going to be enough in cycle 25, cycle 26, cycle 27 to turn it around anytime soon. And I agree with the Starman's predictions here. And I think it's important to know that it doesn't mean that this is the answer to the grand solar minimum theory, but I do want to surround myself with minds that think alike and show consistent reporting. And I feel like with David's work, Zarkova's work, Casey's work, the timelines all line up to me. And none of them talk about glaciation period or ice age. So that's why we don't take that stance of grand solar minimum plunging us into an ice age. A mini ice age is a term used for a period of time of colder and snowier periods of weather. But it is just a term for a temporary condition of the climate. It doesn't mean that we went back to ice age conditions where all life was wiped off the planet, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot to be said. I know some other channels in the community do not care for us because we don't play into their sensational headlines, the gloom and doom factor. Are we going to face challenges? Yes. Is the grand solar minimum going to happen still? Yes. Will we see crop failure and famine? Yes. Will it be on a scale that killed people in the Maunder minimum? That's to be seen. Nobody has that answer. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Nobody has that answer. We have to, this channel is always going to be more about reporting conditions and scientific facts before hanging their hats on predictions. As I'm showing you a prediction chart, but what I'm saying is, out of all the prediction charts I've seen, I feel like this is the most consistent with the rest of the work that I follow and agree with. And guys, that's, 67 for maximum sunspot count. Wow. That's going to be pretty intense. That's that's below Dalton minimum. So there's your between Dalton minimum and Maunder minimum strength right there. His numbers also agree with Zarkova, somewhere between a Dalton and a Maunder, but leaning closer to the Dalton side of the Maunder. The Dalton. Yes, farmers are better now. We have more seed varieties and fungicides to raise crops. Matt, absolutely. So that's another thing you have to look at too. How bad is the crop loss going to be compared to the Maunder minimum? And now Matt Bros from Nebraska hits the nail on the head. The technology in farming is beyond what anyone would have imagined in the Maunder minimum and even the Dalton minimum. So, and the farmers, they adapt by using the science. They look at the data. They've been having trouble with, plants going in late. What do? They put in 92-day corn. Well, guess what? They probably didn't need it this year. But it's a good thing they did it, because now they're going to be able to get their harvest, hopefully on time and not without a lot of damage from early winter or early frost. Farmers are smart. They use the data they get, and they make their adjustments season after season. So I think that there is a good chance that if we continue being innovative in the farming industry, then our food crisis may not be as bad as we've seen in the past. We have evolved as humans and have gotten better at a lot of different things. The point, though, is that we all have to be united in agreeing that we are in a grand solar minimum. It's not going away anytime soon. I say at least through the 2060s. We will see conditions. We will see some brutal winters in regional areas. Some winters, it might seem like it's an entire hemisphere. But as far as people worried about glaciation and moving, I mean, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I know that winters will be rough if you live in the Northeast or the Great Lakes or the Northern Plains. It's going to be cold. I'm not going to deny that. But we're not going to see that kind of strength in winter in the Panhandle of Florida. Now, we have seen cold weather in the South the last couple of years. I'm not going to say it's not going to happen, but it's not a consistent. It's just a freak event that happens for a few days and goes away. If we start seeing months at a time with 20-degree temperatures in Florida, that's when I'd be concerned. But right now, there's nothing that's showing that indication just yet. But again, this is unknown charted territory here. And all we can do is take what's happened in history and apply it to what the sun is trying to signal to us, what it's going to do in the future. Oh, yeah, everything. So, again, guys, I just wanted to put that out there because there's a lot of channels that speak on things that are a little more intense than maybe they should be. And it confuses a lot of people. And I get a lot of questions about super grand solar minimum. And, the biggest question I ask out there is, do you know what a super grand solar minimum is? And the answer I get is, I know enough. I know enough what it is. I don't actually get a description. But if you read the paper that Zarkova wrote, and we've talked to her, we've interviewed her, and you understand what she's saying on how the super grand solar minimum cycle, it's not what some people are. Some people are saying that we're in a super grand solar minimum right now. Yes, that's true. But the strength of it, as far as how cold and bad it gets, we've already gotten past that. We won't see another Maunder minimum like minimum until the end of this 2,000-year cycle in the next 12 to 1,400 years. That's what I'm saying. That and yes, if we do get a giant volcanic eruption, there is a chance that this could be an unusually deep minimum, and it would plunge it past Maunder minimum conditions. So there is that slight possibility. You have to be aware of that. But if you're talking about the cycle doing what a cycle does, it shouldn't be any more severe than what they have between the Dalton and Maunder minimum. As far as pole shift goes, guys, grand solar minimum is enough to keep up with. I don't think anybody really has the answer for pole shift. And if anybody comes out with a date, I just don't see that being useful information, honestly. There's no notoriety for something predicting something that's going to happen 20 years from now. It may not. It may happen tomorrow. It may happen in 100 years. So just beware of certain information. Sometimes it's hard to vet through what's real and what's fake. There's a lot of fake news out there. But I promise you, subscribers of this channel, that we surround ourselves with respectable and valid minds. Zarkova, people like David Birch, other folks on Twitter that we've followed and have interactions with. Just the list goes on and on. Carlos Ramirez. There is so many people in our community that are on the same page and that agree that we have a challenge to face. But it's something that we are going to thrive through. It is something that we are all going to get through. And just like Matt mentioned in the chat, we have evolved. Technologies have evolved. So we will see grand solar minimum still. But I do believe that mankind is smart enough and innovative enough to get past these challenges and continue to thrive without pressing a fear campaign of the topic. All right, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you for listening, and let me have your ears for a little bit and just kind of give you an official stance on grand solar minimum of what we believe, and that this is a long journey, but we are already seeing the effects, the very beginnings of a grand solar minimum now, and they will continue to flash in and out until we get into the really deep part of this grand solar minimum, which will be sometime in the 2030s. But during that time, we've already, like I said, the stuff that we've seen now, expect to continue and get worse before it gets better. All right, guys, have a good evening, and we will talk soon. Take care.
Do you like this show? Give us a thumbs up. Want to support us more? Share to your favorite social media platform, buy a t-shirt, or become a Patreon. All links are in the description below.